"You don't belong in first class, honey, and we both know it." The words cut through the ambient noise of JFK International Airport, like a blade delivered with a smile so sweet it could rot teeth. What the flight attendant didn't know was that she had just insulted the woman who had signed the papers to buy her entire airline 3 hours earlier. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of JFK's Terminal 4, turning the runway lights into watercolor streaks against the November darkness. Inside the exclusive Skybridge Airlines first-class lounge, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and the quiet murmur of conversations conducted in the language of privilege and power. Victoria Kane sat in the furthest corner from the buffet of imported cheeses and top-shelf liquor, deliberately choosing a worn leather armchair that had seen better days. To anyone glancing her way, she looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong terminal entirely. Her faded Howard University hoodie hung loose on her frame, the university logo cracked and peeling from countless trips through industrial washing machines. Her feet were tucked into a pair of white Converse sneakers that had clearly walked more miles than most luxury cars had driven, and the phone in her hands was an iPhone 12 with a spiderweb crack running across the screen like a fault line. Everything about Victoria's appearance screamed ordinary, forgettable, possibly even charity case. That was exactly the point. At 33, Victoria Kane was worth $4.7 billion of fortune, built from nothing but code determination and the kind of hunger that only comes from knowing what it means to have absolutely nothing. Her app CodeStream had revolutionized how small businesses manage their digital presence, and 3 years ago it had been acquired by a tech giant for a sum that made international headlines. But the world didn't know Victoria's face, and that anonymity was her greatest asset in moments like this. She had grown up in Baltimore's roughest neighborhood, raised by her grandmother after her mother had chosen heroin over motherhood. Her grandmother, Nana Ruth, had worked as a hotel cleaner for 40 years, coming home every night with stories that burned themselves into young Victoria's memory. Stories about how guests would look through her like she was invisible, how they would leave messes deliberately just to watch her clean them up, how they would complain to management if she dared to make eye contact or, heaven forbid, smile. Baby girl Nana Ruth had told her on countless evenings as they shared a dinner of rice and whatever vegetables were on sale that week. There's 2 kinds of people in this world: those who see service workers as human beings and those who see them as furniture. You remember that when you grow up. You remember how it feels to be treated like you don't matter. Victoria had never forgotten. Even after CodeStream made her rich enough to buy small countries, she still remembered the weight of industrial cleaning supplies in her teenage hands, the burn of bleach on her skin, the way her feet ached after double shifts at the hotel where she worked to help Nana Ruth pay rent. She remembered because she never wanted to become the kind of person who made others feel invisible. That's why she was here in this lounge dressed like someone who had never seen the inside of a boardroom. 3 hours ago, she had signed the final papers to purchase Skybridge Airlines, an acquisition that had taken 8 months of negotiations conducted through intermediaries and shell companies. The airline's board of directors had been desperate to sell after a series of public relations disasters had sent their stock price into freefall, but they had insisted on one condition: they wanted to meet their new owner in person before finalizing the deal. They had met her this morning in a Manhattan conference room, expecting to shake hands with some tech bro in an expensive suit. Instead, they had found Victoria in a simple black dress and flats, her natural hair pulled back in a neat bun, her handshake firm, and her questions sharper than any knife. The lawyers had done most of the talking, but Victoria had made one thing crystal clear. She wasn't buying Skybridge Airlines as an investment. She was buying it to fix it. The complaints had been pouring in for months. Stories of passengers humiliated by crew members of service that varied wildly depending on how much money someone appeared to have of a corporate culture that had somehow turned the simple act of air travel into a hierarchy of human worth. The board had tried to dismiss these complaints as isolated incidents, but Victoria had done her homework. She had seen the pattern. Now she was about to test that pattern firsthand. Her beat-up backpack sat at her feet, looking like something a college student might carry to the library. Inside it, hidden beneath a layer of deliberately placed fast food napkins and gas station receipts, were the acquisition documents that made her the sole owner of Skybridge Airlines. Also hidden in that bag was a military-grade tablet that contained the personnel files of every employee who would be working Flight 892 to Paris tonight. She had already identified her target, Candice Morrison, 29 years old, 8-year veteran flight attendant with a record that read like a masterclass in passive-aggressive customer service. 7 formal complaints in the past 2 years, all dismissed by supervisors who praised her attention to detail and commitment to maintaining first-class standards. Victoria had read between the lines. Candice Morrison was the kind of flight attendant who decided who deserved good service based on how much their clothes cost. Tonight, Victoria was going to look like she couldn't afford a bus ticket, let alone a first-class seat to Paris. The announcement crackled over the lounge's sound system, delivered in that artificially cheerful voice that Airlines had perfected. Ladies and gentlemen, Skybridge Airlines is pleased to announce the boarding of Flight 892 with service to Paris, France. We invite our first-class passengers to board at this time. Victoria stood slowly, shouldering her backpack and pocketing the cracked phone. Around her, the other first-class passengers began gathering their things: designer luggage and leather briefcases, Hermes handbags, and watches that cost more than most people's cars. They moved with the casual confidence of people who had never been questioned about their right to occupy premium space, people who had never been asked to prove they belonged anywhere. Victoria walked toward the boarding gate, her worn sneakers silent on the polished floor. She could feel the occasional glance from other passengers, those quick visual assessments that people made without thinking. Her hoodie, her shoes, her general lack of obvious wealth markers, they all told a story that these people understood instinctively. She didn't belong with them. Perfect. As she approached the gate, she could see the Skybridge Airlines crew preparing for boarding. The gate agents were efficiently checking documents and managing the boarding process, but her attention was focused on the flight attendants who would be working the cabin. She spotted Candice Morrison immediately standing near the jet bridge entrance with the kind of posture that suggested military precision and barely contained impatience. Candice was exactly what Central Casting would order if they needed someone to play a flight attendant in a movie about airline glamour. Blonde hair pulled into a flawless chignon makeup applied with the precision of a Swiss watch uniform that fit like it had been sewn directly onto her body. She was beautiful in the way that required effort money and a complete commitment to a certain kind of performance. Victoria watched as Candice interacted with the other boarding passengers. Her smile bright and genuine for the man in the $1,000 suit, warm and deferential for the woman with the Cartier watch, cool and professional for the couple who looked like successful small business owners. Each interaction lasted exactly as long as Candice deemed appropriate based on her assessment of the passenger's worth. Victoria pulled out her phone and checked her boarding pass one final time. Seat 1A, the window seat in the front row of first class. The most expensive seat on the plane, purchased with the same credit card she had used to buy the entire airline. She took a deep breath and walked toward the gate, her heartbeat steady despite what she was about to do. This wasn't just about testing one flight attendant's prejudices. This was about understanding the culture that had allowed those prejudices to flourish, the environment that had turned customer service into a judgment panel where some passengers were deemed worthy of basic human dignity, and others were not. Victoria had spent her entire adult life building something from nothing, creating value where none had existed before, employing thousands of people and contributing billions to the economy. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, she was just a woman in a hoodie who didn't look like she belonged in first class, and she was about to discover exactly what that meant. Candice Morrison had perfected the art of reading passengers before they even reached her. In 8 years of flying for Skybridge Airlines, she had developed what she privately called her radar, an ability to assess someone's worth, their social status, their tip potential, and their likelihood of causing problems within the first 3 seconds of visual contact. It was a skill that had served her well, allowing her to provide exceptional service to those who mattered while efficiently managing those who didn't. She stood at the entrance to the jet bridge, her smile locked in place like expensive dental work watching the parade of first-class passengers approach. Each one confirmed what she already knew about the natural order of things. The man in the Armani suit with the Rolex Submariner received her warmest greeting and most genuine eye contact. The woman with the Louis Vuitton carry-on and obvious Botox got the kind of attention that suggested they were old friends. The elderly couple, who looked like they had stepped out of a country club directory, received the sort of deferential service that made them feel important and valued. This was how things worked, Candice knew. This was how they had always worked. People earned respect through success, and success was visible. It showed itself in designer labels, expensive accessories, confident posture, and the general air of someone who was accustomed to being treated well. Those who couldn't or wouldn't present themselves appropriately simply didn't deserve the same level of attention. It wasn't personal, it was practical. Candice had learned this lesson early in her career, watching senior flight attendants navigate the complex social dynamics of premium service. The passengers who looked successful expected excellence and were willing to tip well for it. The passengers who looked like they had probably used miles or gotten some kind of upgrade were just grateful to be there and wouldn't cause problems if the service was merely adequate. The passengers who looked like they didn't belong were usually trying to scam their way into better treatment and needed to be managed firmly before they disrupted the experience for the legitimate first-class customers. It was simple economics, really. Time and energy were finite resources, and Candice had learned to allocate them where they would be most appreciated and most rewarded. Her philosophy had served her well. She had received commendations from supervisors for her attention to detail and commitment to excellence. She had been personally requested by high-profile passengers who appreciated her discretion and professionalism. She had been featured in Skybridge's internal newsletter as an example of what premium service should look like. Her career was on an upward trajectory, and she fully expected to be promoted to purser within the next year. The fact that she had also accumulated 7 formal complaints in the past 2 years was irrelevant as far as Candice was concerned. Those complaints had come from passengers who clearly didn't understand how first-class service worked, people who expected to be treated like celebrities despite obviously being nobodies. Her supervisors had dismissed those complaints appropriately, recognizing that managing passenger expectations was part of the job. Tonight was shaping up to be a good flight. The passenger manifest read like a who's who of successful people, exactly the kind of clientele that made her job enjoyable. She spotted familiar names, repeat customers who knew how to tip and how to treat service professionals with the right kind of respect. There were also several new names that suggested money and status business executives and professionals who would appreciate excellent service and remember it for future flights. And then she saw her. The woman approaching the gate looked like she had gotten lost on her way to the Greyhound station. Her hoodie was faded and cheap, the kind of thing you might find at a discount store or thrift shop. Her sneakers were worn down at the heels, suggesting someone who did a lot of walking, probably because they couldn't afford better transportation. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun that looked like she had done it in a bathroom mirror without proper lighting. Everything about her screamed economy class at best, more likely someone who was flying on a voucher or some kind of charity ticket. Candice's radar immediately went active. This was clearly someone who had either scammed their way into the wrong boarding line or was about to try to talk her way into an upgrade she hadn't paid for. It happened more often than people realized. Passengers who thought that a sob story or a claim of being treated unfairly by some other airline employee would guilt their way into better service than they had actually purchased. Candice had dealt with this type before, and she had learned that the key was to establish boundaries immediately. Be polite but firm. Make it clear that certain standards existed for good reasons, and redirect them to where they actually belonged before they could disrupt the legitimate passengers who were trying to board. The woman approached with what looked like a boarding pass in her hand, but Candice could already tell there was going to be a problem. The woman's posture was too confident for someone who belonged in first class without the visible markers of success. Real first-class passengers carried themselves with a certain casual entitlement, the kind that came from being accustomed to quality treatment. This woman looked like she was trying too hard to appear comfortable, like someone who was nervous about being discovered. Candice activated her most professional smile, the one that was warm enough to avoid accusations of rudeness, but cool enough to establish appropriate distance. She had perfected this expression over years of practice, and it had served her well in situations exactly like this one. "Good evening," Candice said, her voice carrying just the right note of pleasant efficiency. "Welcome aboard Skybridge Airlines. Are you flying with us tonight?" The woman nodded and held out her phone, presumably with a mobile boarding pass displayed on the cracked screen. Candice took note of the phone immediately. It was old, damaged, and clearly belonged to someone who either couldn't afford to replace it or didn't care enough about their appearance to maintain their devices properly. Both possibilities suggested someone who didn't belong in the first-class cabin. "I have seat 1. A," the woman said, her voice quiet but steady. Candice felt her professional smile tighten slightly. Seat 1A was the premier window seat in first class, the most expensive and desirable seat on the aircraft. It was typically occupied by their highest value customers, people who paid full fare and expected exceptional service in return. The idea that this woman in her discount store clothing had legitimately purchased that seat was almost laughable. "I see," Candice said, maintaining her professional demeanor while internally calculating the best way to handle what was clearly a mistake or attempted fraud. "May I take a look at your boarding pass?" She reached for the scanner at her podium, already preparing to deliver the news that there had been some kind of system error or upgrade glitch. The scanner would show the real story, and then she could redirect this passenger to her actual seat in economy while minimizing the disruption to the legitimate first-class passengers who were waiting behind her. But as she aimed the scanner at the phone's cracked screen, something unexpected happened. Beep. The scanner chirped once, and the display showed green. Seat 1A. Confirmed. Candice stared at the scanner display, then at the phone, then back at the scanner. This had to be some kind of mistake. System glitches happened especially with mobile boarding passes. Servers got overloaded, data got corrupted, upgrades got processed incorrectly. There was no way this woman had actually paid for seat 1A. "There seems to be some kind of technical issue," Candice said, maintaining her smile while her mind raced through possible explanations. "Let me just verify this with our system." She tapped the scanner again, hoping for a different result, but the green light flashed again with the same confirmation. Seat 1A. Active. Confirmed. Behind the woman in the hoodie, other passengers were beginning to queue up, and Candice could sense their growing impatience. She needed to resolve this quickly and efficiently before the situation created a scene that would reflect poorly on her professional capabilities. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" the woman asked, and there was something in her tone that Candice couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the nervousness she would have expected from someone trying to pull a scam. It wasn't the defensive anger she was used to hearing from passengers who had been caught in an upgrade attempt. It was something else, something that almost sounded like patience. Before Candice could respond, a voice boomed from behind them, rich with entitlement and irritation. "What's the holdup here?" The voice belonged to James Crawford, a passenger Candice recognized immediately. He was a successful hedge fund manager who flew first class regularly, always in expensive suits, always carrying himself with the kind of confidence that came from having millions in the bank. He was exactly the type of passenger Candice enjoyed serving, someone who understood the value of excellent service and rewarded it appropriately. "Mr. Crawford Candice said, her voice immediately warming as she turned to acknowledge him. So wonderful to see you again. I'm terribly sorry for the delay. We're just sorting out a small technical issue with this passenger's boarding pass. James looked past Candice to the woman in the hoodie, and his expression shifted to one of obvious annoyance mixed with something that looked suspiciously like disdain. Let me guess, he said, his voice loud enough for several other passengers to hear. Another upgrade situation. Someone trying to talk their way into first class. The comment hung in the air like smoke, and Candice felt the situation crystallizing around her. Here was James Crawford, a valued customer who clearly understood what was happening and was giving her permission to handle it appropriately. And here was this woman who obviously didn't belong, standing there with her discount store clothes and her broken phone, probably hoping that persistence would get her something she hadn't earned. Candice made her decision. Sir, I believe this passenger may have received an incorrect upgrade, or there may have been some kind of system error, Candice said, speaking primarily to James while keeping her voice professional. We'll get it sorted out quickly so we can get you and our other first-class passengers boarded properly. She turned back to the woman, her smile now carrying a different energy entirely. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside for just a moment while I verify your ticket with our gate agent. I'm sure we can get you sorted into your correct seat assignment. The woman looked at her steadily, and again Candice noticed that there was no panic in her expression. No guilty shifting or nervous stammering that typically accompanied passengers who had been caught trying to game the system. Instead, there was something that looked almost like disappointment, as if the woman had expected this exact interaction and was somehow saddened to have her expectations confirmed. Check the boarding pass, the woman said simply. I'm in seat 1A. Candice felt her patience beginning to fray. The woman's calm insistence was somehow more irritating than outright anger would have been. It suggested someone who thought they were entitled to treatment. They hadn't earned someone who didn't understand their place in the carefully maintained hierarchy that made premium air travel function properly. Ma'am, Candice said, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge while still maintaining the veneer of professional courtesy. I understand you may be confused about your seat assignment, but I need you to step aside so I can sort this out without holding up our other passengers. She gestured toward James Crawford and the growing line behind him, making it clear where her priorities lay. These were the people who mattered, the people who belonged in first class, the people whose experience she was responsible for protecting. What Candice didn't know, as she stood there in her perfectly pressed uniform, making judgments based on the cost of someone's clothing, was that she had just made the biggest mistake of her professional life. The woman in the hoodie owned the airline. Victoria watched the scene unfold with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a predicted chemical reaction. Every element was falling into place exactly as she had anticipated, every bias and assumption playing out like a carefully choreographed dance. Candice Morrison was performing her prejudices with textbook precision, and James Crawford was providing the perfect chorus of entitled validation. This was what she had come to see. This was the culture she had bought, and this was what she intended to change. Ma'am Candice continued, her voice now carrying an undertone of barely controlled impatience. I'm going to need you to work with me here. Our gate agent can help clarify your actual seat assignment, but right now you're holding up our premium passengers who need to board. Victoria nodded slowly as if she were considering the request. In reality, she was cataloging every word, every gesture, every micro-expression that revealed the flight attendant's true attitude toward passengers she deemed unworthy. This would all be documented, analyzed, and used as a foundation for the comprehensive cultural overhaul she was already planning. I understand you want to verify my ticket, Victoria said, her voice remaining calm and steady. But the scanner already confirmed my seat assignment. I'm not sure what additional verification you need. Behind her, she could hear the murmur of growing impatience from the other first-class passengers. Some were checking their watches, others were making comments under their breath about delays and situations. Victoria recognized the sound of people who were accustomed to having their time valued, and their convenience prioritized people who saw any disruption to their expected experience as a personal affront. James Crawford stepped closer, his physical presence adding weight to his words. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but some of us have connections to make. Can we just get this sorted out?" Candice immediately shifted her attention to him, her posture straightening and her smile becoming more genuine. "Of course, Mr. Crawford. I completely understand your concern. This will just take one moment while I get this passenger redirected to her correct seat." Victoria watched the interaction with professional interest. The way Candice's entire demeanor changed when addressing James Crawford was like watching someone flip a switch. Her voice became warmer, her posture more deferential, her attention more focused. This was customer service in its purest form, tailored specifically to the perceived value of the recipient. "Tell you what," James said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to having his suggestions treated as commands. "Why don't you just let her through and sort it out once we're seated? If there's really a problem with her ticket, the cabin crew can deal with it after we're in the air." It was a reasonable suggestion, and Victoria found herself curious to see how Candice would respond. Would she prioritize efficiency and customer satisfaction for her valued passenger, or would her need to maintain control override her customer service instincts? Candice hesitated for a moment, and Victoria could almost see the calculation happening behind her eyes. On one hand, James Crawford was a premium customer whose opinion mattered. On the other hand, allowing someone she believed didn't belong into first class felt like a violation of the natural order that governed her professional world. "Sir, I appreciate your patience," Candice said finally, "but I have a responsibility to ensure that our first-class cabin maintains its standards. I'm sure you understand." The word standards hung in the air like a judgment, and Victoria felt something cold settle in her chest. This wasn't just about verifying a ticket or following protocol. This was about gatekeeping, about determining who deserved quality treatment based on superficial markers of worth. This was about a flight attendant who had appointed herself the arbiter of human value. "What standards are those exactly?" Victoria asked, her voice still calm, but carrying a new undertone that made both Candice and James look at her more carefully. Candice's smile flickered for just a moment. "Well, we have certain expectations for our first-class passengers. Dress codes, behavioral norms, that sort of thing. We want to maintain a comfortable environment for all our premium customers." Victoria nodded slowly as if she were seriously considering this explanation. "I see. And you've determined that I don't meet these standards based on what exactly?" The question was simple, direct, and completely fair. It was also dangerous because it forced Candice to either admit that she was making judgments based on appearance and perceived social status, or to articulate some other justification for her behavior that would inevitably sound equally prejudicial. Candice's professional training kicked in, and she fell back on the kind of vague corporate language that was designed to sound official without actually saying anything specific. It's just a matter of ensuring that all our passengers feel comfortable, and that we maintain the kind of atmosphere that our premium customers expect. "And you think my presence would make other passengers uncomfortable?" Victoria pressed, genuinely curious to hear how far Candice was willing to take this line of reasoning. James Crawford, perhaps sensing that the conversation was heading in a direction that might reflect poorly on him, as well attempted to redirect it. "Look, this is all very philosophical, but we're just talking about seat assignments here. Let's not make it into something bigger than it is." But Victoria wasn't ready to let it go. She had spent too many years experiencing this exact kind of treatment, and she had seen too many people accept it as normal to let this moment pass without examination. "Mr. Crawford," she said, turning to address him directly, "do you think I look like someone who doesn't belong in first class?" It was a question that forced him to either participate actively in the discrimination he had been passively supporting, or to acknowledge that his assumptions might be unfair. James shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the trap, but not sure how to avoid it. I don't think it's about how anyone looks," he said finally, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe his own words. "It's about having the right ticket." "Exactly," Victoria said. "It's about having the right ticket. Which I have, which your scanner confirmed. So, what's the real issue here?" Candice's professional mask was beginning to slip, revealing the frustration and irritation that had been building underneath. She was losing control of a situation that should have been simple, and she was being questioned in front of other passengers in a way that undermined her authority. "Ma'am," Candice said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "I'm trying to be patient here, but you're creating a scene that's disrupting the boarding process for everyone else. Now I need you to either produce additional verification for your seat assignment, or I need you to step aside and work with our gate agent to resolve whatever issue has occurred with your ticket." Victoria looked around at the other passengers, noting their expressions of impatience, annoyance, and in some cases agreement with Candice's handling of the situation. These were people who were accustomed to seeing service workers manage problems efficiently and discreetly. People who valued their own convenience over someone else's dignity. "What additional verification do you need?" Victoria asked. "Your scanner confirmed my seat assignment. What other proof could I possibly provide?" It was a reasonable question, and Candice clearly didn't have a reasonable answer. Her entire justification for this confrontation was based on intuition bias and assumption, rather than any actual evidence of wrongdoing or policy violation. But backing down now would mean admitting that she had been wrong, that she had treated a legitimate passenger poorly based on nothing but prejudice. Instead of backing down, Candice doubled down. "Ma'am, I've been doing this job for 8 years, and I can tell when something isn't right. Now I'm asking you nicely to work with me here, but if you continue to be disruptive, I will have to call security." The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, and Victoria felt the last of her patience evaporate. This wasn't just poor customer service anymore. This was a threat, an attempt to use the power of authority to force compliance with unfair treatment. Victoria reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card. It was simple, elegant, with just her name and a phone number. No company logo, no title, nothing that would immediately identify her as someone important. She handed it to Candice. "Call that number," Victoria said quietly. "Ask for Captain Reynolds. Tell him Victoria Kane is having a problem at the gate." Candice looked at the business card with obvious confusion and growing irritation. "Ma'am, I don't have time for games. You either need to board the aircraft or step aside, but this conversation is over." Victoria smiled for the first time since the interaction had begun, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of someone who had just confirmed everything she had suspected. Someone who had gathered all the evidence she needed to make the changes she had been planning. "You're right," Victoria said. "This conversation is over. But trust me, this situation is just beginning." She shouldered her backpack, holding her phone with the confirmed boarding pass, and walked past Candice toward the jet bridge. Candice reached out as if to stop her, but Victoria's calm confidence gave her pause. "Ma'am," Candice called after her. "Ma'am, you can't just—" But Victoria was already walking down the jet bridge toward the aircraft, leaving behind a gate area full of confused passengers and one very frustrated flight attendant who had no idea that she had just picked a fight with the person who could end her career with a single phone call. The plane was waiting, and the real show was about to begin. The first-class cabin of Skybridge Airlines Flight 892 was a monument to manufactured luxury all-cream-colored leather and soft ambient lighting designed to make wealthy passengers feel appropriately pampered. Victoria settled into seat 1A, her worn sneakers silent against the plush carpeting as she stowed her battered backpack beneath the seat in front of her. Around her, the other first-class passengers were arranging themselves with the casual efficiency of people accustomed to premium treatment, unpacking tablets and newspapers, adjusting their seats to optimal comfort positions. Victoria pulled out her cracked phone and pretended to scroll through emails while actually observing everything happening around her. The cabin crew was moving through their pre-flight routines with practiced precision, but Victoria was watching their interactions with passengers, noting the subtle differences in tone, attention, and body language that revealed the hierarchy of service that governed this small, enclosed world. Maya Torres, a junior flight attendant who looked to be in her early 20s, was working her way through the cabin with a tray of pre-departure beverages. Victoria watched as Maya offered champagne with genuine warmth and attention to each passenger, making eye contact, smiling naturally, treating each interaction as if it mattered. When Maya reached seat 1A, her approach was exactly the same. "Good evening," Maya said, her smile reaching her eyes in a way that suggested actual customer service training rather than performance. "Can I offer you some champagne before we take off? That would be lovely." "Thank you," Victoria replied, accepting the crystal flute with a small smile of her own. Maya's natural kindness was exactly what good service looked like, and Victoria made a mental note to ensure that this young woman's career would be protected and promoted regardless of what happened tonight. But Maya's shift ended at the forward galley, and Victoria could see Candice Morrison emerging from behind the curtain that separated the galley from the passenger cabin. Candice had changed into her in-flight uniform, and she looked every inch the experienced professional as she began her own circuit of the first-class cabin. Victoria watched her approach through the reflection in her window, noting how Candice's demeanor shifted subtly as she evaluated each passenger. James Crawford received the full treatment. Warm eye contact, genuine smile, deferential body language that suggested he was someone special whose needs mattered. "Mr. Crawford, so wonderful to have you with us again. I've made sure we have your usual in-flight meal preference, and I'll make certain you're not disturbed during the flight unless you need anything." The elderly couple in seats 3C and 3D received polite professional attention, the kind of service that acknowledged their first-class status, without the personal warmth reserved for higher-value passengers. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson. Welcome aboard. Is there anything I can get you settled in?" And then Candice reached seat 1A. The transformation was immediate and unmistakable. Candice's smile became mechanical. Her posture straightened into something more defensive than welcoming, and her eye contact was minimal and dismissive. When she spoke, her voice carried the tone of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than providing service. Beverage Candice asked the word clipped and efficient, devoid of any warmth or genuine interest in the answer. Victoria looked up from her phone, meeting Candice's eyes directly. "I'd like some champagne, please. The same Dom Perignon that Mr. Crawford is having." Candice's expression flickered with something that might have been irritation. "We're actually running low on the premium champagne," she said, her voice carrying the kind of false regret that was clearly a lie. "I can offer you some sparkling wine or perhaps a soft drink." Victoria glanced across the aisle at James Crawford, who was enjoying what was clearly Dom Perignon in a crystal flute identical to the ones being offered to other passengers. She also noticed that Maya had just finished opening a new bottle of champagne in the galley, and there were at least 6 more bottles visible in the service cart. "I see Mr. Crawford has champagne," Victoria said calmly. "And it looks like there's plenty more in the galley. Is there some reason I can't have the same beverage that's being offered to other first-class passengers?" Candice's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Crawford is a Diamond Elite member with special beverage privileges," she said, the lie coming smoothly despite being completely fabricated. "Regular passengers receive our standard beverage service." Victoria nodded slowly as if she were accepting this explanation, though she was actually calculating just how many policies and regulations Candice was violating with her discriminatory service. "I understand. In that case, could I have some water?" "Of course." Candice said, her tone suggesting that this was exactly the kind of reasonable request she could accommodate. "I'll bring you some water." 20 minutes later, Victoria was still waiting for her water. She watched as Candice moved efficiently through the cabin, refilling champagne glasses, offering warm towels, engaging in pleasant conversation with passengers she deemed worthy of attention. Victoria's call button remained unanswered, her request forgotten or deliberately ignored. When Candice finally returned to seat 1A, she was carrying a small plastic cup filled with what was obviously tap water, the kind of container and beverage that would never be offered to a paying first-class passenger under normal circumstances. "Your water," Candice said, setting the plastic cup down with just enough force to make the gesture feel dismissive. Victoria looked at the cup, then at the crystal glasses being used by every other passenger in the cabin. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Could I also see a menu? I'd like to order dinner." Candice paused in her movement away from the seat, and Victoria could see her internal calculation. Dinner service was still an hour away, but taking meal orders early was standard practice in first class, allowing the crew to properly prepare and ensure that passengers received their preferred choices. "Dinner service doesn't begin for another hour," Candice said. "We'll take orders then." "I understand," Victoria replied. "But I noticed you took Mr. Crawford's order a few minutes ago and the couple in 3C and 3D as well. I'd like to place my order now so I can get some work done during the flight without being interrupted later." It was a perfectly reasonable request, the kind that would normally be accommodated without question. But Victoria could see Candice struggling with the conflict between basic service standards and her desire to provide substandard treatment to a passenger she believed didn't deserve better. "We have limited options available tonight," Candice said finally. "I can put you down for the chicken." Victoria smiled politely. "Actually, I'd like the lobster thermidor. I saw it listed as the featured entree on the menu I picked up in the lounge." "The lobster is reserved for our premium passengers." Candice said the lie coming so easily it suggested she had used it before. "I'm sure the chicken will be fine." Victoria looked around the cabin, noting that there were only 8 passengers in first class on a flight that could accommodate 12. How many people ordered the lobster? Candice's hesitation was answer enough, but she pressed on with her fiction. "It's a very popular item. We typically run out. So you're telling me that out of 8 passengers, so many ordered the lobster that there isn't one portion available for me?" Victoria's voice remained calm, but there was something in her tone that made Candice take a half step backward. "Ma'am, I've explained the situation. If you'd like to order something else, I'm happy to accommodate you." Victoria leaned back in her seat, her expression thoughtful. "You know what, Candice? Let me ask you something. Do you enjoy your job?" The unexpected personal question caught Candice off guard. Yes, of course I enjoy my job." "What do you enjoy about it?" Candice looked around the cabin, perhaps checking to see if other passengers were listening to this strange conversation. "I enjoy providing excellent service to our passengers, ensuring they have a comfortable and pleasant flight experience. And do you think you're providing excellent service right now?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Victoria could see Candice processing the implications. To answer honestly would require acknowledging that her service had been anything but excellent. To maintain her position would require continuing to lie in the face of obvious evidence. "Ma'am, I think I've been very accommodating considering the circumstances." "What circumstances are those?" Again, Candice found herself trapped by her own words. Any honest answer would reveal the prejudice that had been driving her behavior, but she couldn't articulate an alternative explanation that would justify her treatment of Victoria. The situation with your ticket earlier and... Well, Candice trailed off, realizing that any path forward would be problematic. Victoria nodded understandingly. "I see. So, because you assumed I didn't belong in first class, you've decided I don't deserve first-class service. Is that an accurate summary?" The directness of the question cut through all the euphemisms and corporate language, laying bare the reality of what had been happening. Candice's face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger, Victoria couldn't tell. "Ma'am, I resent the implication that I would treat any passenger differently based on anything other than their ticket type and our standard service procedures." "Then I'd like the lobster thermidor, please. And I'd like it served on china with proper silverware, the same as every other first-class passenger. And I'd like my water served in a crystal glass, not a plastic cup." The requests were perfectly reasonable, exactly what any paying first-class passenger should expect. But they also represented a direct challenge to the discriminatory treatment Victoria had been receiving, forcing Candice to either provide equal service or to continue her discriminatory behavior in a way that would be obvious to anyone watching. Candice stood there for a long moment, her professional mask wavering as she struggled with a situation that had spiraled far beyond what she had intended. Around them, other passengers were beginning to take notice of the tension, phones were discreetly being positioned to record, and the atmosphere in the cabin was shifting from luxury travel to uncomfortable spectacle. I'll see what I can do," Candice said, finally backing away from seat 1A as if Victoria had become something dangerous. But Victoria wasn't finished. "Candice," she called out, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by nearby passengers. "One more thing. When you bring my dinner, I'd like you to remember that I paid the same price for my ticket as everyone else in this cabin. I'd like you to remember that my money is worth exactly the same as theirs, and I'd like you to treat me accordingly." The words carried weight beyond their literal meaning, and everyone in the cabin understood that they had just witnessed something significant. This wasn't just a passenger complaint about slow service. This was a challenge to the entire structure of how service was provided, who deserved respect, and what equality actually meant at 35,000 feet. Candice retreated to the galley, her face burning with embarrassment and anger, while Victoria settled back into her seat with the satisfaction of someone who had just lit a fuse. The explosion was coming, and everyone in first class was about to learn that appearances could be devastatingly deceptive. 2 hours into the flight, the carefully maintained facade of premium service had begun to crack like old paint under pressure. Victoria had documented every slight, every dismissal, every moment of discriminatory treatment in the Notes app of her cracked phone, building a comprehensive record of exactly how Skybridge Airlines treated passengers who didn't fit their narrow definition of worthy clientele. The pattern had become so obvious that other passengers had begun to notice. Maya Torres, the junior flight attendant, had quietly apologized twice for Candice's behavior, once when she brought Victoria the lobster thermidor that Candice had claimed was unavailable, and again when she replaced the plastic cup with a proper crystal glass without being asked. It was clear that Maya understood the situation was wrong, but her junior position left her powerless to directly challenge her supervisor's treatment of a passenger. James Crawford, meanwhile, had received the kind of attention typically reserved for celebrities or heads of state. Candice had personally ensured his meal was perfect, his champagne glass never empty, his every comfort anticipated before he could even recognize he needed something. The contrast couldn't have been more stark or more deliberate. Victoria was beginning to understand that this wasn't just poor training or individual prejudice. This was an ingrained cultural problem, a deeply rooted belief that some people inherently deserved better treatment than others, based on superficial markers of success and status. It was the kind of institutional bias that couldn't be fixed with a memo or a training session. It required fundamental changes in leadership policy and accountability. She was mentally drafting those changes when the cabin lights dimmed for the evening service and most passengers settled into their seats with books, tablets, or preparation for sleep. Victoria had pulled out her laptop, a sleek device that contrasted sharply with her deliberately shabby appearance, and was reviewing financial documents when she felt the call of nature. The first-class lavatory was located toward the front of the cabin, requiring Victoria to walk past several other passengers to reach it. She stood up quietly, tucking her laptop under her seat, and began making her way down the narrow aisle. The cabin was peaceful, with most passengers absorbed in their own activities, the soft hum of the engines providing a gentle background soundtrack to the artificial tranquility of premium air travel. That's when the turbulence hit. The aircraft lurched suddenly to the left, not the gentle buffeting of normal air disturbances, but a sharp, violent movement that sent anything not secured flying across the cabin. Victoria's feet slipped on the carpet and she instinctively reached out to steady herself, her hand brushing against the armrest of seat 2B as she fought to maintain her balance. James Crawford jerked awake from a champagne-induced doze, his expensive cashmere sweater now bearing the evidence of Victoria's steadying touch. He looked at his sleeve with the kind of horror typically reserved for discovering insects in one's soup, then turned his gaze to Victoria with an expression of pure outrage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" James barked, his voice carrying the indignation of someone who believed his personal space was sacred territory. "You were hovering over me." Victoria straightened herself, her hand still gripping the armrest for stability as the aircraft continued to shake. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice calm despite the obvious anger directed at her. "The turbulence caught me off guard. I was just trying to steady myself." "Bullshit." James snapped, his voice rising loud enough to draw attention from other passengers. "I felt you going through my jacket pocket. You were trying to rob me." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Victoria felt something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't just about poor service anymore. This was an accusation of criminal behavior leveled without evidence based on nothing but prejudice and assumption. "Sir, I was not going through your pockets," Victoria said, her voice still level but carrying a new edge. "I was trying not to fall when the plane hit turbulence." But James was already building his narrative fueled by alcohol entitlement and the same prejudices that had been feeding Candice's behavior all evening. "I know what I felt," he insisted, his voice carrying to every passenger in the first-class cabin. "She was reaching into my jacket, probably looking for my wallet or my phone." Other passengers were turning to look now, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern, to something that looked suspiciously like agreement with James's assessment. Victoria realized with growing alarm that she was facing something more dangerous than poor customer service. She was facing the kind of mob mentality that turned assumptions into facts, suspicions into certainties. "That's absurd," Victoria said, her voice finally showing some heat. "Why would I rob someone on an airplane? Where exactly would I go with your wallet at 35,000 feet? But logic wasn't driving this confrontation anymore. James Crawford was performing for an audience of people who shared his worldview. People who found it entirely believable that someone who looked like Victoria would resort to petty theft if given the opportunity. Candice James shouted toward the galley. "Candice, we have a situation here." Candice emerged from behind the curtain like an avenging angel, her face already set in an expression of grim satisfaction. This was the moment she had been expecting all evening, the inevitable consequence of allowing someone inappropriate into the first-class cabin. In her mind, this validated every assumption she had made, every discriminatory action she had taken. "Mr. Crawford," Candice said, her voice carrying both concern and authority, "what's happening?" "This woman," James pointed at Victoria as if she were evidence in a criminal trial, "was going through my jacket while I was sleeping. I caught her red-handed trying to steal from me." Candice's eyes lit up with something that looked disturbingly like triumph. "Ma'am," she said, turning to Victoria with the kind of stern authority typically reserved for unruly children. "Is this true?" "Absolutely not," Victoria replied, her patience finally beginning to fray. "I was walking to the restroom when we hit turbulence. I reached out to steady myself and accidentally touched his armrest. That's all." But Candice was clearly not interested in Victoria's version of events. "Mr. Crawford, are you certain about what you experienced?" "Damn right." "I'm certain," James replied, his voice growing more confident as he sensed support from the flight crew. I felt her hands near my jacket pocket. She was definitely trying to steal something. Victoria looked around the cabin, noting the expressions of the other passengers. Some looked uncomfortable with the escalating situation, but others were nodding in agreement with James's accusations. The elderly couple in 3C and 3D were whispering to each other while shooting disapproving glances in Victoria's direction. A businessman in seat 4A was openly staring with the kind of fascination people reserved for watching car accidents. Ma'am, Candice said, stepping closer to Victoria in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. I'm going to need you to return to your seat immediately. I was on my way to the restroom, Victoria said, standing her ground despite the pressure she could feel building around her. You need to return to your seat now. Candice repeated her voice, taking on the tone of someone issuing a command rather than making a request. Given the circumstances, I can't allow you to move freely around the cabin. The implications of that statement hit Victoria like a physical blow. Candice was essentially placing her under house arrest based on an unsubstantiated accusation from a passenger who clearly had his own prejudices. This wasn't customer service anymore. This was discrimination escalating into something that approached false imprisonment. What circumstances? Victoria asked, her voice sharp with anger. A passenger made an accusation without any evidence. Are you telling me that's enough to restrict my movement on this aircraft? Ma'am, I have a responsibility to ensure the safety and security of all passengers. Candice replied, falling back on corporate language to justify actions that were clearly outside any reasonable policy. Until this situation can be properly investigated, I need you to remain in your assigned seat. Victoria felt the walls closing in around her, the weight of prejudice and assumption creating a suffocating atmosphere that had nothing to do with cabin pressure. This was how it happened, she realized. This was how discrimination escalated from poor service to criminalization, from inconvenience to injustice. But Victoria Kane hadn't built a $4 billion company by backing down from bullies, and she wasn't about to start now. I want to speak to the captain, Victoria said, her voice carrying a new authority that made several passengers look at her more carefully. That's not necessary, Candice replied quickly, perhaps sensing that involving the captain might complicate her narrative. We can handle this internally. I want to speak to the captain. Victoria repeated each word carefully enunciated. Now. Candice's mask of professional authority flickered for just a moment, revealing something that looked suspiciously like panic. Ma'am, the captain is busy flying the aircraft. He doesn't get involved in cabin disputes. Victoria smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. Call him, she said quietly. Trust me, he'll want to know about this. Something in Victoria's tone made Candice hesitate, a note of confidence that didn't match the situation as she understood it. Why would someone caught in an attempted theft be so insistent on involving the highest authority on the aircraft? But before Candice could respond, the decision was taken out of her hands. James Crawford, emboldened by what he perceived as crew support for his position, decided to escalate the situation himself. You know what James said, standing up from his seat to tower over Victoria, his voice carrying the kind of aggressive certainty that came from a lifetime of having his opinions validated. I don't think talking to the captain is enough. I think we need to have the police waiting when we land. This is theft, and she needs to be arrested. The words dropped into the cabin like stones into still water, creating ripples of tension that spread throughout the first-class section. Victoria felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest, the final straw that would transform this situation from a lesson in corporate culture to a moment of reckoning that would change lives forever. You want to have me arrested? Victoria said slowly, her voice carrying a dangerous calm that made even James take a half step backward. Based on your claim that I was reaching for your wallet, which you have no evidence for, which didn't actually happen. I know what I saw, James insisted, though his voice carried slightly less conviction than it had moments before. Victoria nodded thoughtfully as if she were seriously considering his position. Mr. Crawford, "Can I ask you something? Do you know who I am?" The question was simple, but something in Victoria's delivery made the entire cabin fall silent. Even Candice stopped her aggressive posturing, sensing that the dynamic of the situation was shifting in ways she didn't understand. "I know you're someone who is trying to steal from me," James replied, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. Victoria reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, the cracked screen reflecting the cabin lights like a broken mirror. "I want you to remember this moment," she said quietly. "I want you to remember exactly what you accused me of and exactly what you said should happen to me." She hit a number on her speed dial and the phone rang once before being answered. "Captain Reynolds," she said into the phone, her eyes never leaving James Crawford's face. "This is Victoria Kane. We have a code red situation in the first-class cabin and I need you up here immediately." The name hit the cabin like a bomb blast. Victoria Kane. Some passengers didn't recognize it, but James Crawford did. His face went white as he realized he had just accused one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs in the world of trying to steal his wallet. Candice looked like she had been struck by lightning, the pieces of the evening suddenly falling into place in the most horrifying way possible. Victoria ended the call and looked around the cabin at the faces staring back at her, some confused, some shocked, some beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria said, her voice carrying to every corner of the first-class cabin, "allow me to introduce myself properly. My name is Victoria Kane, and as of this morning I am the sole owner of Skybridge Airlines." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to absorb sound rather than simply mark its absence. Now Victoria continued, her voice still calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "Let's talk about what customer service actually means." The revelation of Victoria's identity hit the first-class cabin like a pressure wave, leaving passengers and crew reeling as they tried to process the complete reversal of everything they had assumed about the evening's events. James Crawford stood frozen in the aisle, his face cycling through expressions of shock, horror, and desperate calculation as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Candice Morrison looked like she had been physically struck, her carefully maintained professional composure cracking like ice under sudden heat. But the most dangerous moment in any confrontation is not when positions are being established, but when they are collapsing. When people who have committed to a course of action based on false assumptions must choose between admitting their error and doubling down on their mistakes. Candice chose to double down. "I don't care who you claim to be," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of desperation and defiance. "That doesn't change what happened here. Mr. Crawford is a valued passenger, and his accusations need to be taken seriously." Victoria looked at her with something approaching sympathy, recognizing the psychology of someone who was drowning and pulling others down with her, rather than admitting she couldn't swim. "Candice," she said gently, "you're making this worse for yourself. I suggest you step back and think carefully about your next words." But Candice was beyond rational thought now, trapped by her own prejudices and the public nature of her mistakes. In her mind, backing down would mean admitting that everything she had believed about social hierarchy and customer service was wrong. It would mean acknowledging that she had humiliated herself and damaged her career based on nothing but bias and assumption. "You've been disruptive and aggressive this entire flight." Candice continued, her voice rising as she tried to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her ability to manage. "You've created problems, made unreasonable demands, and now you're being accused of theft by another passenger. I don't care what your name is or what company you claim to own, you don't get to intimidate crew members or threaten other passengers." The accusation of intimidation was rich, coming from someone who had spent the entire flight treating Victoria like a second-class citizen, but Victoria recognized that Candice was operating from a place of panic now rather than logic. Sometimes people would rather destroy themselves than admit they were wrong, and Victoria could see that Candice was heading down that exact path. James Crawford, meanwhile, was trying desperately to find a way out of the hole he had dug for himself. "Look," he said, his voice taking on a conciliatory tone that hadn't been there minutes earlier. Maybe there was some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe I misinterpreted what I saw. It was a reasonable attempt at damage control, but it came too late and with too little conviction to be believable. Victoria could see in his eyes that he was calculating the potential cost of his accusations, wondering if there was a way to walk back his claims without admitting that they had been based on prejudice rather than observation. "Mr. Crawford," Victoria said, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining something to a child, "you didn't misinterpret anything. You made an assumption about me based on how I look, and when an opportunity arose to justify that assumption, you took it. You accused me of theft not because you saw me commit a crime, but because you believe people who look like me are criminals." The psychological analysis was clinical in its precision, and James flinched as if he had been slapped. "That's not... I would never..." "You would never what?" Victoria pressed. "You would never assume that a black woman in a hoodie was trying to rob you, because that's exactly what you just did in front of a cabin full of witnesses without a shred of evidence." The racial element of the situation hung in the air like a toxic cloud finally named and acknowledged, after hours of being the unspoken foundation for everything that had occurred. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing their own complicity in the assumptions that had led to this moment. Others looked around as if seeing the situation clearly for the first time, understanding that they had witnessed something much more serious than a simple customer service dispute. Maya Torres, the junior flight attendant, was standing near the galley with tears in her eyes, finally understanding the full scope of what her supervisor had been doing all evening. She had known Candice's treatment of Victoria was wrong, but she hadn't had the authority or confidence to challenge it directly. Now she was watching her colleague destroy her career in real time, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Mrs. Kane," Maya said quietly, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. "I want to apologize for everything that happened tonight. This isn't how we're supposed to treat passengers, any passengers." Victoria turned to look at the young woman, seeing genuine remorse and professional integrity in her expression. "Thank you, Maya. I appreciate that, and I want you to know that your service tonight has been exemplary." The contrast between Maya's respectful professionalism and Candice's discriminatory behavior was stark, and it highlighted everything that was wrong with the culture Victoria had purchased along with the airline. Good employees were being overshadowed by bad ones. Proper training was being undermined by personal prejudices, and customers were receiving wildly different levels of service based on factors that had nothing to do with their ticket class or reasonable expectations. Candice watched this exchange with growing fury, seeing her authority being undermined and her position being challenged by a passenger she still couldn't quite accept as legitimate. The cognitive dissonance was tearing her apart, the conflict between what she was seeing and what she had believed about social order creating a kind of mental static that prevented rational thought. "You think you can just waltz in here and intimidate us?" Candice said, her voice taking on a hysterical edge that made several passengers reach for their phones to record what was clearly about to become a significant incident. "You think because you claim to be important, we're just supposed to ignore your behavior?" "What behavior, specifically?" Victoria asked, her voice remaining calm in the face of Candice's escalating agitation. "Asking for the same service as other passengers, requesting basic courtesy, defending myself against false accusations," but Candice was beyond rational discussion now, trapped in a spiral of embarrassment, anger, and desperation that was driving her toward an action that would define the rest of her life. "Your attitude," Candice snapped, stepping closer to Victoria in a way that felt aggressive and threatening. "Your entitlement. Your complete disrespect for the crew and other passengers." Victoria could see what was happening, could recognize the signs of someone about to cross a line they could never uncross. She had seen it before in business negotiations, the moment when someone realized they were losing and decided to flip over the table rather than accept defeat gracefully. Candice Victoria said, her voice carrying a note of warning. "I strongly suggest you take a step back and think about what you're doing. You're about to make a mistake that will follow you for the rest of your life." But the warning only seemed to inflame Candice further, suggesting, as it did, that Victoria had some kind of power or authority that Candice was supposed to fear. In Candice's mind, this was still just a passenger getting uppity, someone who needed to be reminded of their place in the hierarchy that governed air travel. "Don't tell me what to do," Candice hissed, her professional mask finally slipping completely away to reveal the ugly prejudice that had been driving her actions all evening. "You don't get to come on my aircraft and tell me how to do my job." "Your aircraft?" Victoria asked, raising an eyebrow. Interesting choice of words. The comment was the final straw for Candice, the last small push that sent her over the edge of rational behavior, into a place where pride and prejudice overwhelmed professional training and basic human decency. "You need to shut your mouth," Candice said, her voice rising to just short of a shout. "And remember that you're a passenger on this airline, not the owner of it, no matter what lies you want to tell." Victoria looked at her steadily, seeing the moment crystallizing around them like amber preserving an insect. This was it, the point where words would become actions, where the evening's discrimination would escalate into something that could never be taken back. Candice Victoria said one final time, "Don't do this. Whatever you're thinking of doing right now, don't do it." But Candice was already moving her hand, rising through the air with the kind of violent precision that comes from pure, unfiltered rage. The slap connected with Victoria's left cheek with a sound that seemed to echo through the cabin like a gunshot, sharp and final and impossible to misinterpret. Victoria's head snapped to the side with the force of the blow, and for a moment the entire first-class cabin seemed suspended in time. Passengers frozen in their seats. Phones still recording the normal sounds of flight operations continuing while human civilization took a momentary pause. Victoria slowly turned her head back to face Candice, one hand rising to touch her cheek where a bright red handprint was already beginning to form. There was no anger in her expression, no shock or outrage or hurt. There was only a kind of profound sadness, the look of someone who had hoped to be wrong about human nature, but had just been proven definitively right. "Thank you," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the absolute silence of the cabin. Candice blinked, confused by the response. "What?" "Thank you for proving every point I wanted to make about the culture of this airline." Victoria continued, her voice calm and measured, despite the violence she had just experienced. "Thank you for demonstrating exactly why I bought this company, and exactly what needs to change." Victoria reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, the cracked screen reflecting the cabin lights as she dialed a number. The phone rang once before being answered. Captain Reynolds. Victoria said into the phone, her eyes never leaving Candice's face. "Your flight attendant just struck a passenger. I need you in the cabin immediately to arrest her for assault." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Candice finally understood the magnitude of what she had just done. She had not just slapped a passenger, she had assaulted the owner of the airline in front of witnesses while being recorded on multiple devices. Her career was over. Her life, as she had known it, was over. And the woman she had struck was still looking at her with that terrible, patient sadness, as if Victoria had known this moment was coming all along and had simply been waiting for Candice to choose her own destruction. "Ma'am," Candice whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," Victoria interrupted gently. "You meant every bit of it. And now we all know exactly who you are." The cabin remained frozen in shocked silence as Victoria stood there with the mark of violence on her face, waiting for the captain to arrive and begin the process of justice that would change everything for everyone involved. The slap had been heard around the first-class cabin. Soon it would be heard around the world. The mechanical sound of the cockpit door unlocking reverberated through the first-class cabin like a judge's gavel cutting through the stunned silence that had settled over the passengers and crew. In the post-9/11 world of commercial aviation, the cockpit door was sacrosanct, a barrier that remained sealed no matter what chaos might erupt in the passenger compartments. The fact that it was opening now during the middle of flight operations sent a clear message that something unprecedented was occurring. Captain David Reynolds emerged from behind the armored door with the bearing of a man who had spent 30 years commanding aircraft and managing crises. At 58, he carried himself with the kind of authority that came not from rank or title, but from proven competence in situations where lives depended on clear thinking and decisive action. His uniform was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly groomed, and his eyes were the kind of steely gray that suggested someone who had seen everything aviation could throw at him and had never flinched. Reynolds surveyed the scene before him with the clinical assessment of a professional evaluating a tactical situation. He took note of Victoria standing calmly near seat 1, the red handprint on her cheek stark against her brown skin. He observed Candice Morrison frozen in the aisle, her face cycling between defiance and dawning horror as the reality of her situation began to penetrate her consciousness. He noted the positions of the other passengers, some still holding phones that were recording others pressed back in their seats as if trying to distance themselves from the confrontation. Most importantly, he noted the atmosphere in the cabin, the electric tension that suggested violence had occurred and might occur again if not properly managed. Ms. Kane Reynolds said, his voice carrying the kind of respectful formality typically reserved for addressing heads of state or board chairmen, "I received your call. Are you injured?" The captain's immediate deference to Victoria sent another shockwave through the cabin, confirming her identity and authority in a way that no amount of self-introduction could have achieved. James Crawford, who had been standing frozen in the aisle since the revelation of Victoria's identity, finally understood the full scope of his situation and sank back into his seat, as if his legs could no longer support him. "I'm fine, Captain Reynolds," Victoria replied, though she made no attempt to hide the mark on her cheek. "But we have a situation that requires your immediate attention." Candice finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Captain, there's been a misunderstanding. This passenger has been disruptive all evening, and when she became aggressive, it was self-defense. The lie was so transparent and desperate that it would have been pathetic if it weren't so dangerous." Reynolds looked at Candice with the expression of someone evaluating a broken instrument that might endanger the aircraft, his professional assessment cutting through any personal feelings he might have about the situation. Ms. Morrison Reynolds said, his voice carrying the kind of cold authority that could cut through metal. "Are you telling me that a passenger seated in 1A became physically aggressive toward you, requiring you to defend yourself?" Candice nodded eagerly, grasping at the lifeline of her fabricated narrative. "Yes, sir. She was making unreasonable demands, creating disturbances, and when Mr. Crawford reported that she was attempting to steal from him—" "Stop talking!" Reynolds commanded, his voice sharp enough to cut off Candice's explanation mid-sentence. "Ms. Morrison, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because your future depends on your understanding it completely." The captain's tone carried the weight of absolute finality, the voice of someone delivering a verdict rather than engaging in discussion. Around the cabin, passengers leaned forward unconsciously, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would define careers and possibly lives. Ms. Kane is not just any passenger. Reynolds continued, his eyes never leaving Candice's face. She is the sole owner and chairman of Skybridge Airlines. She owns this aircraft. She owns the fuel in the tanks. She owns the uniform you're wearing. She signs the paychecks that pay your salary. With each word, Candice seemed to shrink physically, the reality of her situation crushing down on her like atmospheric pressure. Her mouth opened and closed silently, her brain struggling to process information that overturned everything she thought she knew about power authority and social hierarchy. Furthermore, Reynolds continued relentlessly, Ms. Kane informed me this morning that she would be conducting a covert evaluation of our passenger service standards specifically to assess reports of discriminatory treatment in our premium cabins. You have been under observation all evening by the person who has the authority to terminate your employment immediately. The revelation hit the cabin like another bomb blast. Victoria hadn't just been a random passenger experiencing discrimination. She had been conducting a deliberate test of the airline's culture, and Candice had failed that test in the most spectacular way possible. Maya Torres, who had been standing near the galley throughout the confrontation, finally understood why Victoria had seemed so calm throughout the evening's events, why she had documented everything so carefully, why she had seemed almost unsurprised by each escalation. Victoria had been conducting an investigation, and Candice had provided all the evidence any reasonable person could need to conclude that Skybridge's service culture was fundamentally broken. Captain James Crawford said, his voice barely audible as he attempted to inject himself back into the conversation. I think there may have been some confusion about what happened earlier. I may have misinterpreted. Mr. Crawford, Reynolds said without turning to look at him, you accuse the owner of this airline of attempting to steal from you. I suggest you remain silent until we reach our destination, at which point you can discuss your situation with whatever legal counsel you can afford. The dismissal was complete and devastating, reducing James from a valued customer to a legal liability in the space of a single sentence. Victoria watched the interaction with professional interest, noting how quickly social dynamics could shift when actual authority was revealed and exercised. Mrs. Morrison, Reynolds said, returning his attention to the flight attendant who had started the evening with complete confidence in her position and authority. You have assaulted a passenger in front of multiple witnesses while being recorded on several devices. You have violated Federal Aviation Regulations, company policy, and basic human decency. You are relieved of duty effective immediately. Candice's legs finally gave out, and she sat down heavily in the nearest aisle seat, her career collapsing around her like a building that had just lost its foundation. Captain, please, she whispered, tears beginning to flow down her face. I didn't know. If I had known who she was? Stop, Victoria said, speaking for the first time since the captain's arrival. Her voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the cabin. Don't say you didn't know who I was. Say you didn't know I was human. The words hit like a physical blow, cutting through all the euphemisms and rationalizations to expose the ugly truth at the heart of the situation. Candice had treated Victoria poorly, not because she didn't recognize her as the airline's owner, but because she hadn't seen her as deserving of basic dignity and respect. The fact that I own this airline is irrelevant. Victoria continued, her voice gaining strength and carrying to every corner of the cabin. What matters is that I'm a human being who paid for a service and deserved to be treated with basic courtesy. What matters is that you decided I wasn't worthy of that courtesy, based on nothing but my appearance. Victoria looked around the cabin at the other passengers, making eye contact with each of them as she spoke. Every person who flies with this airline, whether they're in first class or economy, whether they're wearing a designer suit or a hoodie from a discount store, whether they're a billionaire or someone flying on their savings from years of hard work, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. The impromptu speech was delivered without passion or anger, but with the kind of moral clarity that made arguments unnecessary and resistance futile. This wasn't about revenge or punishment. Victoria was explaining a fundamental principle of human interaction that should have been obvious but clearly wasn't. Captain Reynolds, Victoria said, turning back to the pilot, I want Ms. Morrison removed from active duty immediately. When we land, I want her escorted from the aircraft by security and banned from all Skybridge properties pending a full investigation of her conduct. Understood, Reynolds replied with the crisp efficiency of someone receiving clear orders from a superior officer. I also want Mr. Crawford placed on our permanent no-fly list effective immediately. His behavior this evening demonstrated a pattern of discrimination and false accusation that makes him a liability to other passengers' safety and dignity. James Crawford started to protest, but Reynolds cut him off with a sharp look that suggested further comment would be unwise. Victoria's authority was absolute, her ownership giving her the power to make decisions that would be implemented immediately and without appeal. Furthermore, Victoria continued, I want Maya Torres promoted to acting head of cabin crew, effective immediately. Her professionalism and integrity this evening have been exemplary, and she represents the kind of service culture we need to build throughout this airline. Maya looked stunned by the sudden promotion, but she straightened her shoulders and nodded with the kind of determination that suggested she understood the responsibility that had just been placed on her. Victoria turned back to Candice, who was still sitting in the aisle seat like a broken doll. Her career and her future shattered by a single moment of violence born from years of unchallenged prejudice. Ms. Morrison. Victoria said, her voice gentler now, but no less serious. I want you to understand something. This isn't happening to you because I'm powerful and you're not. This is happening because you chose to treat another human being as less than human. That choice has consequences, and those consequences don't care about your intentions or your feelings or your financial obligations. Candice looked up at Victoria through her tears, finally seeing her not as a problem passenger or a threat to be managed, but as a person whose dignity she had trampled and whose humanity she had denied. I'm sorry, Candice whispered, the words inadequate, but genuine. Victoria nodded slowly. I believe you are, but sorry doesn't undo the damage, and it doesn't change the pattern of behavior that led to this moment. Change requires more than regret. It requires accountability. Captain Reynolds stepped forward, his presence filling the space with quiet authority. Ms. Morrison, please collect your personal items and report to the crew rest area for the remainder of the flight. Security will be waiting to escort you from the aircraft when we land. As Candice stood on unsteady legs and made her way toward the galley to gather her things, the first-class cabin began to return to something approaching normal operation. But everyone present understood that nothing would ever be quite the same again, that they had witnessed a moment when the hidden assumptions that governed their world had been exposed and challenged in a way that would have lasting consequences. Victoria settled back into seat 1. Her phone already buzzing with messages that suggested word of the evening's events was beginning to spread beyond the confines of the aircraft. The real work of cultural change was just beginning, but the first and most important step had been taken. The mask had been torn away, and there was no putting it back on. The remainder of Flight 892 passed in an atmosphere that felt fundamentally different from the carefully manufactured luxury that had characterized the first half of the journey. With Candice Morrison confined to the crew rest area and Maya Torres stepping into her new role as acting head of cabin service, the first-class cabin began to operate the way it was supposed to work, with genuine courtesy extended equally to all passengers, regardless of their appearance or perceived social status. Victoria spent the remaining hours of the flight doing what she did best, planning and strategizing. Her laptop was open, and she was drafting a comprehensive restructuring plan for Skybridge Airlines that would address not just individual cases of discrimination, but the underlying cultural systems that had allowed such behavior to flourish unchallenged. She was designing new training programs, revised hiring practices, and accountability measures that would ensure tonight's events could never be repeated. But the work was interrupted regularly by passengers who approached her seat to apologize, to express support, or simply to process what they had witnessed. The elderly couple from 3C and 3D came forward to tell her about their own experiences with discriminatory treatment during their travel stories they had never reported because they hadn't believed anyone would care. A businessman from row 4 admitted that he had made the same kinds of assumptions about Victoria that had driven the evening's events, and he wanted to understand how to do better. Most significantly, James Crawford approached her seat about an hour before landing, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked like genuine shame. "Ms. Kane," he said, his voice quiet and carefully controlled, "I know there's nothing I can say that will undo what I did tonight. But I want you to know that I'm going to use this experience to examine my own biases and hopefully become a better person." Victoria looked at him steadily, weighing his words against his actions and trying to determine whether his remorse was genuine or simply expedient. "Mr. Crawford," she said finally, "the test of whether you've learned anything won't be in your words, but in how you treat the next person you encounter who doesn't look like you or dress like you or seem to belong in the same spaces you occupy." He nodded, understanding that he was being given a challenge rather than absolution. "I understand, and thank you for showing me who I really am." It wasn't pleasant, but it was necessary. As James returned to his seat, Victoria reflected on the complexity of human behavior and the possibility of genuine change. Some people like Candice Morrison seemed to be driven by prejudices so deep and unexamined that they would rather destroy themselves than question their assumptions. Others, like Maya Torres, had the natural integrity and empathy that made good service possible when supported by proper leadership and policies. And some, like James Crawford, fell somewhere in between, capable of horrible behavior, but also capable of growth and change when confronted with the consequences of their actions. The challenge for any organization was creating systems that supported the good behaviors while making the bad ones impossible or at least costly enough to discourage. Captain Reynolds appeared at her seat as the aircraft began its descent into Paris, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who had handled a complex situation successfully. "Ms. Kane," he said, "I've been in contact with our ground security team in Paris. They'll be boarding the aircraft as soon as we reach the gate to escort Ms. Morrison to the authorities. French law enforcement has been briefed on the situation and will be handling the assault charges." Victoria nodded, though she felt no satisfaction in Candice's approaching arrest. The evening had been about exposing and changing a culture, not destroying individuals, but some actions had consequences that extended beyond personal regret or corporate policy changes. "Captain, I want to make sure that Ms. Torres has all the support she needs in her new position. She showed real leadership tonight under very difficult circumstances." "Understood. She'll have access to whatever resources and training she needs to succeed. And I want to establish a new protocol for handling passenger complaints about discriminatory treatment. Every incident needs to be investigated thoroughly with real consequences for crew members who fail to meet our standards." Reynolds nodded approvingly. "It's long overdue. We've been too willing to dismiss complaints as misunderstandings or isolated incidents instead of looking for patterns." Victoria closed her laptop as the aircraft touched down at Charles de Gaulle Airport, the gentle bump of landing marking the end of a journey that had accomplished far more than simple transportation from New York to Paris. The real work of change would happen on the ground in meeting rooms and training centers, in policy documents and hiring decisions, in the thousand small choices that would either reinforce the old culture of discrimination or build something better. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Victoria could see the flashing blue lights of security vehicles through her window. The authorities were already in position, ready to board and take Candice into custody for the assault that had been witnessed by a dozen passengers and recorded on multiple devices. It was an ending that felt both inevitable and tragic, the natural consequence of choices made over years of unchallenged prejudice. When the aircraft came to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign chimed off, Captain Reynolds made an announcement that would be remembered by everyone who heard it. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Paris. Before you disembark, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something significant that occurred on this flight. Tonight we witnessed both the worst and best of human behavior. We saw discrimination, false accusations, and violence. But we also saw courage, integrity, and the possibility of positive change." The captain's voice carried the weight of someone delivering a eulogy for an old way of thinking. Skybridge Airlines is committed to ensuring that every passenger, regardless of their appearance, background, or social status, receives the respectful treatment they deserve. What happened tonight will never happen again, not on my aircraft, and not on any aircraft in our fleet. As the passengers began to disembark, Victoria remained in her seat, watching Maya Torres coordinate with the security officers who had boarded to escort Candice from the aircraft. The young flight attendant handled the situation with professional competence that suggested she would thrive in her new leadership role, treating even Candice with dignity, despite what had occurred. Candice walked past Victoria's seat in handcuffs, escorted by 2 French police officers. She looked broken, a woman whose world had collapsed in the span of a few hours because she had never learned to see other people as fully human. For a moment their eyes met, and Victoria saw not anger or defiance, but a kind of hollow understanding of how completely her life had changed. Ms. Kane, Candice said softly as she passed, "I want you to know that I understand now. What I did, who I was. I'm sorry doesn't cover it, but it's all I have." Victoria nodded once, acknowledging the apology without accepting or rejecting it. Some damage couldn't be undone with words. Some lessons could only be learned through consequences, and some changes required the complete dismantling of old systems before new ones could be built. As the cabin emptied and Victoria finally stood to gather her belongings, Maya approached her with a mixture of gratitude and determination in her expression. "Ms. Kane," Maya said, "I want to thank you for this opportunity, and I want you to know that I understand the responsibility that comes with it. I won't let you down." Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile she had shown all evening. "Maya, I have complete confidence in you. But more than that, I have complete confidence in what we can build together. Tonight was ugly, but it was also necessary. Now we get to create something better." As Victoria walked off the aircraft and into the Paris terminal, she carried with her not just the satisfaction of having exposed a serious problem, but the excitement of someone who had identified a challenge worthy of her time and resources. Skybridge Airlines would become a model for how companies could address discrimination, not just through policy changes, but through fundamental cultural transformation. The slap that had echoed through the first-class cabin would soon echo around the world, but its impact would be measured not in punishment, but in progress, not in careers destroyed, but in dignity restored for countless future passengers who would benefit from the changes that started with one woman's refusal to accept being treated as less than human. 3 hours after Victoria Kane had been escorted by French authorities through the Charles de Gaulle Airport VIP lounge, where she provided a detailed statement about the events of Flight 892. She was sitting in the first-class cabin of Skybridge Airlines Flight 1247 bound for New York. This time, however, she was traveling in her official capacity as the airline's owner, having shed the disguise of worn clothing and cracked phones for the tailored business attire that marked her as someone accustomed to corporate authority. The difference in treatment was stark and immediate. From the moment she had identified herself at check-in, she had been surrounded by obsequious airline employees eager to ensure her comfort and satisfaction. The gate agent had personally escorted her to the aircraft. The captain had emerged from the cockpit to welcome her aboard, and the flight attendants were treating her with the kind of deferential attention typically reserved for royalty. But Victoria was more interested in observing how these same crew members treated other passengers, particularly those who didn't appear wealthy or important. She watched a young mother struggling with a crying baby receive patient assistance from a flight attendant, saw an elderly man in a worn sweater offered the same premium beverage options as the businessman in the expensive suit. This was how service was supposed to work, she realized, when properly managed and consistently enforced. Maya Torres was working this return flight as well, having been temporarily assigned to accompany Victoria back to New York for an intensive series of meetings about the airline's future direction. Victoria had specifically requested that Maya work the flight so she could observe her leadership style and begin the process of preparing her for broader responsibilities within the company. Mrs. Kane, Maya said, as she approached Victoria's seat during the initial beverage service. "How are you settling in? Is there anything specific I can get for you?" "I'm fine, thank you, Maya. But I want you to tell me something honestly. How common is the kind of behavior we saw from Candice last night?" Maya glanced around the cabin to ensure their conversation was private, then leaned closer with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this exact question. "More common than it should be," she said quietly. Candice wasn't unique. She was just more obvious about it than some others. Victoria nodded, unsurprised, but still disappointed to have her suspicions confirmed. "Tell me about the training you received when you started with Skybridge. We had 2 weeks of classroom instruction covering safety procedures, service standards, and company policies. But honestly, most of what I learned about how to actually treat passengers came from watching senior flight attendants on the job. And some of them..." Maya trailed off, clearly struggling with whether to criticize her colleagues. "Some of them taught you that passengers should be treated differently based on how much money they appear to have." Exactly. It was never written down anywhere, but the message was clear. First-class passengers get excellent service. Business class gets good service. Economy gets adequate service. And people who look like they don't belong anywhere get whatever you feel like giving them. Victoria felt her jaw tighten as Maya confirmed what she had suspected about the cultural problems that went far beyond individual bias. This was institutional discrimination built into the training and reinforcement systems that shaped how employees understood their jobs and responsibilities. "Maya, I want you to help me understand something. When you saw how Candice was treating me last night, why didn't you intervene more directly?" Maya's expression showed genuine anguish as she considered the question. "Because I was scared," she admitted. "Candice was my supervisor. She controlled my schedule, my performance reviews, my opportunities for advancement. Speaking up against her meant risking my career, and I convinced myself that I was helping by being extra nice to you when she wasn't looking. But that wasn't enough. No, it wasn't. I was protecting myself instead of protecting you, and I've been thinking about that all night. About how many other passengers I've watched get mistreated while I stood by and did nothing because it was safer for me." Victoria appreciated Maya's honesty and self-reflection, recognizing in it the kind of moral courage that could be developed and supported with proper leadership. "Maya, I don't want you to carry guilt about last night. You were in an impossible situation, and you handled it as well as anyone could reasonably expect. But I do want you to help me ensure that future employees never face that same impossible choice." "How do we do that?" Victoria opened her laptop and pulled up the document she had been working on throughout the previous day. "We change everything. New training programs that emphasize dignity for all passengers. New evaluation systems that reward employees for treating everyone well, not just the obviously wealthy. New reporting procedures for discrimination complaints. And most importantly, new leadership that models the behavior we expect." Maya leaned forward to look at the screen, her eyes widening as she saw the scope of the changes Victoria was planning. "This is comprehensive. It has to be. The problems we saw last night didn't develop overnight, and they won't be fixed by small adjustments. We need to rebuild the culture from the ground up." Victoria scrolled through sections of the document as she spoke, showing Maya detailed plans for everything from hiring practices to customer service metrics. Every new employee will go through bias recognition training. Every supervisor will be evaluated on how well their teams treat all passengers, not just the profitable ones. And every complaint will be investigated by people who understand that discrimination is a systemic problem, not just individual bad behavior. What about employees who resist the changes? People like Candice, who seem to believe that treating some passengers poorly is part of their job. Victoria's expression grew serious. People who can't or won't adapt to treating all passengers with dignity will find other jobs. We'll provide training support and reasonable time for adjustment, but ultimately this isn't optional. Discrimination will be grounds for immediate termination, full stop. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude and the cabin settled into the quiet rhythm of long-distance flight, Victoria found herself thinking about the broader implications of what had happened on Flight 892. The story was already beginning to spread through social media, with passengers who had witnessed the events sharing their experiences and uploading videos that showed Candice's assault and Victoria's revelation of her identity. By the time they landed in New York, Victoria knew the incident would be international news, with implications that extended far beyond one airline's internal policies. This would become a case study in corporate culture, an example of how discrimination could flourish in organizations that didn't actively work to prevent it, and hopefully a model for how meaningful change could be implemented when leadership was committed to doing better. Maya Victoria said as the flight attendant prepared to continue her service rounds, "I want to offer you a choice. You can continue working as cabin crew while helping to implement our new training programs, or you can transition into a management role focused specifically on cultural change and employee development." Maya's eyes lit up with possibility. "You're serious about making me part of the solution, more than part of it. I want you to help lead it. You understand the problems from the inside. You've experienced the pressure to conform to discriminatory practices, and you've shown the integrity to recognize when those practices are wrong. That makes you exactly the right person to help build something better." As Victoria looked around the cabin at passengers and crew members going about their routine activities, she felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from her work since selling CodeStream. Building a tech company had been intellectually satisfying and financially rewarding, but changing an entrenched culture of discrimination felt like something that could make a real difference in people's lives. The turbulence they had experienced on Flight 892 had been more than just unstable air. It had been the shaking apart of assumptions and systems that had operated unchallenged for too long. Now came the harder work of building something stable and fair in their place. Something that would serve all passengers with the dignity they deserved. Victoria opened a new document on her laptop and began typing, starting with a simple principle that would govern all the changes to come. Every passenger who flies with Skybridge Airlines, regardless of appearance, background, or social status, deserves to be treated with courtesy, respect, and dignity. This is not an aspiration. This is a requirement. It was a beginning, the foundation for everything else that would follow. The real test would come not in policy documents or training manuals, but in thousands of daily interactions between crew members and passengers, in moments where people chose between bias and fairness, between comfort and courage. But Victoria Kane had spent her entire adult life turning impossible challenges into achievable goals, and she was confident that with the right people and the right systems, even the most entrenched cultural problems could be solved. The revolution had begun at 35,000 feet, but its impact would be felt on the ground in every airport and aircraft, in every moment where human beings chose to see each other clearly and treat each other well. 6 months later, Victoria Kane stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office in Skybridge Airlines' Manhattan headquarters, looking down at the late-afternoon traffic flowing through the city streets 40 floors below. The view was impressive, but her attention was focused on the tablet in her hands displaying the latest customer satisfaction scores that told the real story of the company's transformation. Overall, passenger satisfaction was up 37% from the previous year. Complaints about discriminatory treatment had dropped by 82%. Employee satisfaction scores had risen to industry-leading levels as staff found themselves working in an environment that valued integrity over hierarchy. Most importantly, passenger loyalty was at an all-time high, with customers choosing Skybridge specifically because of the airline's reputation for treating everyone with dignity and respect. The numbers were gratifying, but Victoria knew they represented far more than corporate success metrics. They represented thousands of individual interactions where people had chosen to see each other as human beings rather than social categories, millions of moments where dignity had triumphed over prejudice. Ms. Kane, Maya Torres, knocked softly on the office door, her voice carrying the confidence that had developed over months of successful leadership in her new role as Director of Cultural Development. "The film crew is ready for you." Victoria turned from the window, adjusting the jacket of her navy business suit as she prepared for the final interview in a documentary that would tell the complete story of Flight 892 and its aftermath. The film, produced by an independent studio known for their investigative work, had been following the airline's transformation for the past 6 months, documenting everything from new employee training sessions to passenger testimonials to the broader industry changes that Skybridge's example had inspired. "How did the interview with Candice go?" Victoria asked as they walked toward the conference room that had been converted into a temporary studio. Maya's expression grew serious. Difficult to watch, but important. She was genuinely remorseful about what happened and honest about the prejudices that drove her behavior. The producers think her perspective will help people understand how discrimination can seem normal to people who've never examined their assumptions. Victoria nodded, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness about Candice Morrison's situation. After serving 3 months in French prison for assault, Candice had been deported to the United States and permanently banned from working in the airline industry. She was currently employed as a cashier at a discount retail store in Ohio, earning minimum wage and struggling to rebuild a life that had been shattered by her own choices. But Candice had also become an unexpected advocate for change, speaking at diversity training sessions and corporate seminars about the dangers of unchecked bias. Her story served as a powerful warning about how prejudice could destroy not just its victims, but the people who chose to embrace it. The conference room had been transformed into a professional interview setup with soft lighting and carefully positioned cameras that would capture Victoria's final thoughts on the experience that had changed her company and, in many ways, her life. The documentary's director, a woman whose previous films had won awards for their examination of social justice issues, greeted Victoria with the kind of respect that suggested she understood the significance of the story they were telling. "Ms. Kane, thank you for agreeing to participate in this project. I know it hasn't always been comfortable to have cameras documenting such personal and painful experiences." Victoria settled into the interview chair, looking directly into the camera with the calm confidence that had served her well in countless business meetings and board presentations. The discomfort was necessary. Real change requires honest examination of ugly truths, and that's never comfortable. "When you boarded Flight 892 that evening, did you expect the situation to escalate the way it did?" Victoria considered the question, carefully remembering the mixture of hope and cynicism she had felt as she prepared for her undercover evaluation. "I hoped I was wrong about the extent of the cultural problems, but I was prepared for the possibility that they were as bad as the complaints suggested. What I wasn't prepared for was how personal it would become, how much it would hurt to be treated as less than human by people whose job was supposed to be serving passengers." The assault was captured on multiple phones and has been viewed millions of times online. "How do you feel about the fact that your experience became such a public symbol?" "I'm grateful for the attention, honestly. Individual experiences of discrimination usually remain invisible because they happen in private moments between people with unequal power. Having this incident witnessed and recorded meant it couldn't be dismissed or minimized, the way so many other cases of discrimination are." The interviewer leaned forward slightly, her expression reflecting the gravity of the topic. "Some critics have argued that your wealth and position gave you advantages in seeking justice that other victims of discrimination don't have. How do you respond to that?" Victoria's expression grew thoughtful, acknowledging the complexity of the question. "They're absolutely right. I had resources and authority that most people don't have, and that made it possible for me to create consequences for discriminatory behavior in ways that other victims can't. But that's exactly why this story matters. If discrimination is this blatant and harmful when directed at someone with my advantages, imagine how much worse it is for people who don't have any protection or recourse. What's been the most significant change you've implemented at Skybridge? The accountability systems, Victoria replied, without hesitation. We track how employees treat all passengers, not just the obviously wealthy ones. We investigate every complaint about discrimination seriously, and we've made it clear that treating any passenger with disrespect will end your career with us. When people know their behavior has real consequences, behavior changes. And what's been the response from employees? Mixed initially. Some people resented having their assumptions challenged and their behavior monitored more closely. But most employees have embraced the changes because they want to work for a company they can be proud of. It turns out that most people prefer treating others with dignity when they're given clear expectations and proper support. The interviewer consulted her notes briefly before asking her final question. If you could send a message to other business leaders watching this documentary, what would you want them to understand? Victoria looked directly into the camera, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had seen both the worst and best of human behavior in corporate environments. Discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's operationally stupid. When you treat customers differently based on prejudice rather than merit, you're literally throwing away money and talent and opportunities. But more than that, you're creating a culture where cruelty becomes normal and dignity becomes optional. She paused, gathering her thoughts for a statement that would serve as both conclusion and call to action. Every organization has a choice about what kind of culture it wants to create. You can build systems that reward bias and hierarchy, or you can build systems that reward fairness and respect. The choice you make doesn't just affect your bottom line, it affects the lives of everyone who interacts with your company. As the interview concluded and the film crew began packing their equipment, Victoria felt a sense of completion that had been building throughout the months of documentation and reflection. The story that had begun with a slap in an airplane cabin was becoming something larger, a case study in how individuals and institutions could choose to do better when confronted with the consequences of their choices. Maya approached her as the conference room returned to its normal configuration, carrying a tablet with the latest metrics from their transformation efforts. The preliminary numbers from this quarter are even better than we expected, she said, her voice carrying pride in what they had accomplished together. Customer complaints are down, employee satisfaction is up, and we're actually profitable again for the first time in 2 years. Victoria smiled, looking at the data that confirmed what she had believed from the beginning, that treating people well wasn't just the right thing to do, it was good business. Maya, I want you to know how proud I am of the work you've done. You've proven that real change is possible when people are committed to making it happen. I learned from watching you, Maya replied. You showed me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to accept being treated badly, even when that refusal comes at a cost. As the day drew to a close and the office began to empty of employees heading home to their families and their lives outside of work, Victoria remained at her window looking out at the city and thinking about the ripple effects that had spread from a single evening of confrontation and revelation. The documentary would premiere next month, carrying the story to audiences around the world who would see both the ugliness of unchecked discrimination and the possibility of meaningful change. Other companies were already reaching out to Skybridge for consultation on their own cultural transformation efforts, recognizing that the airline had developed a model that could be adapted to different industries and contexts. But perhaps most importantly, thousands of passengers were flying on Skybridge aircraft every day, experiencing the kind of respectful service that should be standard everywhere, but still felt revolutionary in its consistency and genuine care for human dignity. Victoria picked up her phone and scrolled through the latest customer feedback, reading messages from passengers who had noticed and appreciated being treated well, regardless of their appearance or apparent social status. One message from a young black woman flying alone for the first time particularly caught her attention. "I want to thank Skybridge Airlines for making me feel safe and welcome throughout my flight. As someone who has experienced discrimination in other travel situations, I was nervous about flying alone, but your crew made me feel like my comfort and dignity mattered just as much as any other passengers. This is what good service looks like." Victoria closed her phone and gathered her things, preparing to head home with the satisfaction of knowing that the work they had done was making a real difference in real people's lives. The transformation of Skybridge Airlines had begun with her willingness to experience discrimination firsthand and refuse to accept it as normal. But it would continue through thousands of daily choices by employees who had learned to see every passenger as deserving of dignity, respect, and excellent service, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. The revolution that had started at 35,000 feet was now happening on the ground in every interaction where human beings chose to treat each other well. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of JFK International Airport's Terminal 4, casting long shadows across the polished floor where Victoria Kane stood waiting for her flight to London. She was traveling in her official capacity as CEO of Skybridge Airlines today, but she had deliberately chosen to dress casually in jeans, a simple sweater, and comfortable sneakers, wanting to observe how her employees treated passengers who didn't immediately appear to be VIPs. The gate area around her bustled with the usual mix of business travelers, families, and individuals whose stories she could only guess at from their appearance and behavior. An elderly man in a worn but clean suit was reading a paperback novel while his wife dozed in the chair beside him. A young mother was juggling a baby and a toddler while trying to organize their boarding documents. A group of college students was sharing snacks while reviewing what appeared to be study materials for an upcoming exam. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're pleased to begin boarding for Skybridge Airlines Flight 447. With service to London Heathrow." The gate agent announced, her voice warm and professional. "We invite passengers traveling with young children, passengers requiring special assistance, and our first-class passengers to board at this time." Victoria watched as the Skybridge employees managed the boarding process with the kind of efficient courtesy that had become standard since the company's cultural transformation began. The gate agent smiled genuinely at each passenger, made eye contact, offered assistance where needed, and treated everyone with the same level of professionalism regardless of their ticket class or appearance. Most importantly, she noticed how the flight attendants greeted passengers as they boarded the aircraft, each interaction reflecting the training and cultural changes that had been implemented throughout the company. There was no sorting of passengers into worthy and unworthy categories. No differential treatment based on clothing or perceived social status, just consistent, respectful service for everyone who had purchased a ticket. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message from Maya Torres, now serving as Vice President of Customer Experience and Cultural Development, who was working this flight and had spotted Victoria in the boarding line. "Welcome aboard, boss. I promise you'll have a completely boring, discrimination-free flight today." Victoria smiled and typed back, "That's exactly what I'm hoping for. Boring is the goal." As she settled into her first-class seat, Victoria noticed that the passenger in 1B was the elderly man she had observed reading in the gate area. His suit was clearly not expensive, and his luggage was well worn but clean and carefully maintained. The flight attendant serving first class today was someone Victoria didn't recognize, a new hire who would have gone through the comprehensive bias awareness training that was now standard for all Skybridge employees. "Good morning, sir," the attendant said to the elderly gentleman, her tone exactly as warm and respectful as it would have been for any passenger. "Welcome aboard. Can I take your jacket for you, or is there anything else I can help you get settled?" "That's very kind. Thank you." The man replied with a smile that suggested he wasn't accustomed to such attentive service. "This is actually my first time flying first class. My daughter surprised me with an upgrade for my birthday." "How wonderful," the attendant replied, her enthusiasm genuine rather than performative. "We'll make sure it's a memorable experience. Would you like some champagne before we take off, or perhaps some juice or coffee?" Victoria watched the interaction with professional satisfaction, noting that the service was exactly what it should be: attentive, respectful, and focused on the passengers' comfort rather than their perceived social status. This was what good training looked like when it was properly implemented and consistently reinforced by leadership that actually cared about treating people well. When the flight attendant reached Victoria's seat, the service was equally professional, with no special deference or recognition of her position within the company. "Good morning and welcome aboard. Is this your first time flying with Skybridge Airlines?" "No," Victoria replied with a small smile, "but I always look forward to seeing how you're doing." As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its taxi to the runway, Victoria reflected on how much had changed since that evening 6 months ago when she had boarded Flight 892 in disguise. The transformation of Skybridge Airlines had been more successful than even she had dared to hope, with measurable improvements in customer satisfaction, employee morale, and financial performance that proved treating people well was not just ethically right, but also good business. The documentary about Flight 892 had premiered 2 months earlier to critical acclaim and widespread attention, sparking conversations about discrimination in corporate culture that had led to similar transformation efforts at companies across multiple industries. Victoria had been invited to speak at business schools, diversity conferences, and corporate leadership seminars about the experience and the lessons learned from it. But perhaps most importantly, the story had inspired individual employees throughout the service industry to examine their own biases and commit to treating all customers with dignity and respect. Victoria regularly received messages from flight attendants, hotel workers, restaurant staff, and others who had recognized themselves in Candice Morrison's story and decided to change their behavior before it was too late. The plane lifted off smoothly, climbing into the clear morning sky above New York City, and Victoria looked out at the familiar skyline with a sense of contentment that came from knowing her work was making a real difference in the world. Building CodeStream had made her wealthy, but transforming Skybridge Airlines was making her proud. Her phone buzzed with another message, this one from an unexpected source. It was from Candice Morrison, who had maintained occasional contact with Victoria as part of her ongoing effort to understand and atone for her actions on Flight 892. "Saw the documentary last night. Thank you for letting me tell my side of the story. I know it doesn't change what I did, but I hope it helps other people recognize their biases before they destroy someone else's dignity the way I did yours. My new job isn't glamorous, but my manager says I'm the most respectful employee they've ever had with customers. I guess getting completely humbled taught me something valuable. I hope you're well." Victoria read the message twice, feeling the complex emotions that always arose when she thought about Candice's situation. There was no satisfaction in knowing that her former employee was struggling financially, but there was some comfort in seeing evidence that genuine change was possible, even for people who had seemed completely committed to their prejudices. She typed back a brief response. "Thank you for sharing your story. It takes courage to admit mistakes publicly, and I respect that. I hope you continue finding ways to treat others with the dignity we all deserve." As the flight reached cruising altitude and the cabin settled into the peaceful routine of long-distance travel, Victoria opened her laptop and began reviewing the latest reports from Skybridge's cultural transformation initiatives. The data continued to show progress, but more importantly, the anecdotal evidence suggested that real lasting change was taking root in the company's operations. Employee retention was up particularly among staff members who had previously felt pressured to participate in discriminatory practices. Customer complaints about poor service had dropped to near zero, while compliments about excellent service had increased dramatically. Most significantly, passengers were choosing Skybridge specifically because of the airline's reputation for treating everyone with respect, creating a competitive advantage based entirely on basic human decency. Victoria closed the laptop and looked around the first-class cabin, noting how peaceful and comfortable the atmosphere was when everyone was being treated well. The elderly gentleman in 1B was enjoying his champagne and chatting warmly with the flight attendant about his upcoming visit to London. A businessman across the aisle was working quietly on his computer, occasionally pausing to thank crew members for their attentive service. A young woman in 2C was reading a book, looking completely relaxed and comfortable in an environment that validated her right to be there. This was what air travel was supposed to be like, Victoria realized. Not a hierarchy where some people were deemed worthy of dignity and others were not, but a shared experience where everyone who had purchased a ticket received the respectful treatment they had paid for. The transformation of Skybridge Airlines had begun with a single moment of violence born from unchecked prejudice, but it had evolved into something much larger. A demonstration that corporate culture could be changed, that discrimination could be eliminated through proper leadership and accountability, and that treating people well was not just morally right, but also practically effective. Victoria settled back in her seat and closed her eyes, feeling the satisfaction of someone whose work was making the world a little bit better, one interaction at a time. The revolution that had started with a slap at 35,000 feet was now happening on the ground in every moment where human beings chose to see each other clearly and treat each other with the dignity that everyone deserved. The flight continued smoothly toward London, carrying passengers who would never know how much safer, more respectful, and more dignified their travel had become because one woman had refused to accept discrimination as the normal price of existing while black in America, and had used her power not for revenge but for real lasting change that would benefit countless others for years to come. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of courage, justice, and transformation. Share your thoughts in the comments about times when you've witnessed or experienced discrimination, and how we can all work together to create a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Your voice matters, and together we can build a society where character is valued more than appearance, and where basic human decency isn't revolutionary. It's simply the standard we all expect and deserve.